Okay, so this is part 2 of the Postmodernism lecture, and if you thought the first part was weird and kind of, whoa, it's a bit off the wall, strap yourself in because this is going to blow your mind. So I'm going to use this video to talk about one of the theorists that I think is a great exemplar of postmodernist thought and gives a great example of how postmodernist theory can help us think about the media, and that's Jean Baudrillard, the French sociologist. Before I begin, if you want to read a really great book on Baudrillard and his relationship to media, read Baudrillard and the Media by William Merrin from our department. Baudrillard is an incredibly interesting thinker to me because he makes us question not just what the media does in terms of our social relationships and our relationships towards one another, but also the wider effect of the media on culture itself. If you take this quote here on this slide, we live in a world where there is more and more information and less meaning. What Baudrillard argues is that the symbolic interchange, and the symbolic exchange of signs has become the primary mode of communication and indeed culture within our society. So we live in massive systems of symbolic interchange, but there's no meaning underpinning that because all we exchange is signs. Think of Instagram, for example. We're just constantly involved in the exchange of different symbolic representations of reality, but the reality underpinning it is no longer important. It's just the exchange of those things for other certain commodities like likes and comments, which become important to us, and the reality itself is no longer important at all. What is being captured, how it's been captured, why it's been captured becomes less important to the exchange of the sign itself. And that's really Baudrillard's idea here, is that, there's more and more information out there and less meaning because we don't look for the meaning. We just look to exchange the information continually over and over out as a form of commodity in our society. So really Baudrillard gets to this kind of way of thinking through one of his early pieces of work, The Systems of Objects. And what he's interested in here is how sort of sign value has become more important than use value and exchange value over time. And you can go into this and you can have a look at the system of objects if you want. William's excellent book on it. But the important thing here that Baudrillard is arguing is that in a society where information exchange has become important, it is the symbol, it is in itself the value of the sign and the exchange of the sign which has become important. If we look at the top line there, in terms of symbolic exchange, we have. I need an example here to explain this for you guys really sort of importantly. A symbolic exchange here is a sort of a gift, a symbol, relation to subject, for example, the wedding ring. In terms of use value, we would look at things like this, automobile as transportation. In terms of exchange value, we look at economy, commodity, market worth. The book costs $19.99. So really these are, if you like, sort of modernist sort of Marxist ways of thinking of things: the use value, the exchange value, exactly, and indeed the act of an exchange of a symbol in some ways, which doesn't have market value attached to it or use value attached to it, has a particular set of values. What Baudrillard's interested in is the notion of the sign and the sign value itself. So what he argues is that we increasingly live in a society where, for the essence of something which is consumption, its value is as a sign, its meaning is only in relation to other signs, and examples of this would be like clothing and fashion. These have become incredibly important things. So okay, great, I found my example. Let's think of Instagram, right? Why didn't I think of that before? On Instagram, we exchange signs with one another. So what we are wearing and where we are wearing it become signs, but through our capture of them as an image. That sign has a particular value in accordance with relation to other signs, that is, other photographs on Instagram. And our consumption, therefore, becomes the valuable commodity within contemporary society. We are rated, and we are, if you like, our sense of self-value and self-worth comes from our exchange of particular signs within society. I think I got that right? So what is Baudrillard's work doing? It's a critique of Western consumer society, the historical replacement of lived symbolic relations, like the exchange of the ring, etc., or use value or exchange value, with the semiotic order, just the meaning of things that as it's constructed in relation to all other signs within a society and its signs, and the processing and signs and reduction of meaning to the semiotic order itself and its organization of references to other signs within society. Our entire society, according to Baudrillard, in an information age, is just the circulation of signs and the processing of signs and reduction of all meaning to this semiotic order. There is no meaning beyond the semiotic. And that's kind of depressing. All we're interested in is a continual reproduction and recirculation of signs within our information society. There's nothing underpinning that. If we looked for anything deeper in value or deeper in meaning than that, we're going to strike out. We're going to get short. So, you know, the symbolic exchange of the past, you know, you had a gesture like a wedding ring or something, and that symbolized something deep. Now a wedding ring is just something to be circulated as a sign. You take a photograph of it, you show it off to other people. In 5 seconds it's gone because somebody sees something else. You know, the meaning underpinning that is no more than what its value is as that sign at that point in time. And society is just made up of millions, billions of this sign circulating at all times. So how does Baudrillard's thought sort of progress from there? So in the consumer society in 1970, he applied these ideas to the mass media. So basically electronic media replaced the symbolic with the semiotic. The symbolic, the meaningful exchange of value in particular ways in society has just been replaced with the semiotic. You take the raw lived event of things and process them into signs to be exchanged over and over again for a particular value. These signs combine to produce the television event. What Baudrillard says the television event is, yes, it's an event, yes, it has meaning, but it's not real. It's a construction. It's just a group of signs that have been positioned together in order to construct a particular thing. It's not a real thing in any meaningful sense. So the consumer society, therefore, in this consumer society, people and organizations simultaneously actualize and dramatize the real. So we create the real and we dramatize it in producing it as a spectacle, and that deactualizes the real in that it distances ourselves from it. So whatever happened has been dramatized in particular ways through the transformation of it all in just a series of signs. And actually, as an audience, we are distanced from it because we are not close to what really happened. So to quote Baudrillard, we live sheltered by signs in the denial of the real. We consume the semiotics of things whenever in contact with the real, and indeed we accept what is presented to us as real when it is not real. Therefore we are ever further from the real and we're in denial of the real. As Baudrillard says, we consume the simulation and experience the world without any experience of the world. We sit and we believe, you know, Instagram gives us a window on the world, Twitter gives us some kind of insight into the world, and we consume that simulation without ever experiencing what's actually real itself. So, going further than that, into some of Baudrillard's later work, simulacra and simulations. A simulacrum is something that looks like somebody or something else, that is made to look like somebody or something else. Baudrillard's argument is the signs combine to form simulacra, and this gives us a sense of hyperreality. We are surrounded by the simulacra, we basically consume simulations, and therefore we exist in a state of hyperreality. The distinction between of truth and false is impossible, and indeed the real just implodes because of the growing density of simulation. We are never in the real, we're in the hyperreal, the constructed real. So the seamless manipulation in which the seams between reality and virtuality will be deliberately blurred, and real tanks can engage simulator crews on real terrain which is simultaneously further. This is one of the problems with Baudrillard. He gets kind of confusing, right? But what is he actually arguing here around simulation? Simulation becomes so intense that we can't tell the difference between the simulation and the real. And when we can't tell the difference between the two, actually, the difference between the two becomes unimportant anymore. We might be consuming the real at some point, we might be consuming the simulation at some point, but we don't know because we can't tell the difference between the two anyway. So why I talked about virtual reality a little in the first lecture of this. For Baudrillard, the intensification of this the symbolic order, if you like, and the exchange of the sign and the prioritization of the symbolic in society has meant that now we live in a state where we can't tell the difference between the virtual and the real. And you know, an event like this where real tanks can engage a simulator crew on real terrain which is simultaneously vertical, that's entirely possible, and we wouldn't be able to tell what is virtual and what isn't. To go with that quote there, the simulacrum now hides not the truth, but the fact that there is none. That is to say, the continuation of nothingness. What the simulation now hides is the very fact that it's a simulation. That's what Baudrillard is saying in that quote. The simulation is so intense, so all-pervasive, so ubiquitous in our lives that we cannot any longer distinguish that the world as is presented to us through the media is a simulation. That's intense. So we have a deterrence of the real. The more closely the real is pursued with colour, depth, and a technical improvement after the other, the greater does the absence from the world grow. We grow further from the real as media improves. And in this media age where we are connected 24/7 to the visual representations of the world given to us by platforms like Instagram, we grow further from the real all the time. When we're sitting around playing our new PlayStation 5s with its ray tracing graphics and, you know, incredibly realistic graphical representations of the world, we're actually further from the real. We're not closer to it, we're further from it all the time because the simulation becomes so intense. So, in terms of the real and unreal, modern unreality no longer implies the imaginary. It engages more reference, more truth, more exactitude. It consists in having everything pass over into the absolute evidence of the real. As in hyperrealist painting, where one can discern the grain of the face's skin, and unwanted microscopics that lacks even the charm of the uncanny. Hyperrealism is not surrealism. It is a vision that hunts down seduction by means of visibility. One gives you more. This is already true of colour in film or television. One gives you so much colour, etc., with all the accents, with nothing to add. That is to say, nothing to give in exchange. You might think, oh my God, I don't even understand that quote. What are you getting at? Let's break it down. Because that's what we're here to do. We're here to break it down. We're taking a postmodern position. Yeah, we're trying to understand these things critically. Let's look at that first line. Modern unreality no longer implies the imaginary. It engages more reference, more truth, more exactitude. It consists in having everything pass over into the absolute evidence of the real. The unreal is the real. The unreal is now so exact, so detailed, so brilliant, so well constructed, so well conceived, so technologically perfect that it is the real. So the unreal isn't about an imagination. It's not about fantasy. It's not about being flawed or uncanny, or being slightly off from experience so we can tell this is not real. The unreal is now about being more real than real and convincing us that that is the real when it is not real. A bit mad, right? But if you think back to sort of my definitions of modernity, right, you can see how this postmodernist position when applied to the media is so powerful. The media is convincing us that these things are real, right? That there is only one reality, the reality that's presented to you. What Baudrillard is arguing is that none of this is real, but it's so powerful that we accept it as real. So the modernist position of the media, that, you know, we present reality, Baudrillard's arguing, actually you produce something which is so perfect it never could be real. We could never take that position. It never could happen that way. It's too perfectly edited. It's too perfectly told. It's too much of a story. It's crazy stuff. Some examples might help you follow this. So Disneyland, in terms of the hyper-real and imaginary. Disneyland, according to Baudrillard, exists in order to hide that it is the real country. All of real America that is Disneyland. I love this guy so much. Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real. Whereas all of Los Angeles and the America surrounds it are no longer real, but belong to the hyper-real order and to the order of simulation. Disneyland is no less real than the rest of America around it, because the way that we understand America is through the media. And the media just constructs the reality, just as Disneyland is a constructed reality. Disneyland is a hyper-reality, So is America. So is everywhere. What we understand about the world is a hyper-reality in itself. So saying Disneyland isn't real is to ignore the fact that what we know of the world is not real. It's just a construction, a very, very detailed and intense construction, but a construction nevertheless, because we are consumed by the simulation, and all we consume is the simulation. So to say that Disneyland is not real is to miss the point. Indeed, the purpose of Disneyland is to convince us that there is a real when there isn't one. Wow, good stuff. No? Perhaps Baudrillard's most infamous comment was in 1991, an infamous work. The Gulf War did not take place. This refers to the Gulf War of 1990, where a coalition of Western forces invaded and firstly liberated Kuwait and Kuwait City from Iraqi forces, and then battled back Iraq into past the borders of the country of Iraq. According to Baudrillard, this was a simulation, a simulacrum, if you will. A hyper scenario in which events lose their identity and signifiers fade into one another. Fascination and horror at the reality which seemed to unfold before our eyes mingled with a pervasive sense of unreality as we recognized the elements of Hollywood script and as the signifiers of past events faded into those of the present. The absurdity of the media's self-representation as purveyor of reality. You might think, what is going on here? Is he saying like that a war didn't take place? Yeah, absolutely right. For us at home, it didn't take place. What we had was the media's creation of a war. In that creation, the war followed typical, stereotypical narratives that we saw in Hollywood films. The signs and symbols we were given were eerily similar to those we've seen before in representations of war, real or otherwise, from Hollywood or from footage in the past. The media was constructing a war out there. As it happened, the war was over very, very quickly. The Iraqi forces crumbled. But you wouldn't have got that picture from the media. The media was in intense conversation about how significant the Iraqi war machine was, how difficult their armies would be to combat. As it was, there was virtually no war. A war usually requires two armies fighting. This one in 1990 really didn't have two armies fighting. The war was over virtually instantly. What we had as a media audience was countless media displays of the sort of war going on itself, with the spectacle of rockets flying through the streets of Baghdad with cameras on them, smart rockets hitting targets with intense precision, showing a reality of the war which didn't exist because it didn't show all the dead people afterwards. It just showed the precision and humanity of the effort of those on one side of the war to preserve life when 300,000 Iraqis died during this conflict. What we were presented with as an audience at home was not the reality of what happened during that conflict. We were given a constructed reality of it, which we accepted as real. Just a set of signifiers out there which constructed a reality for us which had no bearing towards the reality of what happened on the ground during that conflict. So the Gulf War, as experienced by those in the West who were an audience for it, did not take place. A set of events took place, but they were not those events. But conventional wisdom and conventional knowledge about that conflict is now framed by how the media constructed that conflict. Now, for Baudrillard, this is a classical example of how the simulation is more real than the real. Nobody wanted to see the real. The real is grim. The real is dead kids and dead women and dead bodies all across Iraq. The real is, the idea that actually the hype and so on about how difficult the war would be was a complete myth. Nobody wanted that. They wanted a war like we understand wars to be through the movies. So the media constructed that war for us. The Gulf War, as experienced by those who weren't there, and even as experienced by those who were there, were watching CNN all day. Didn't happen. The simulation happened, and we accept the simulation as the real. And that's what Baudrillard's argument really is. And you can see now why Baudrillard is a postmodernist. The modernist interpretation of what happened, that these were events, didn't happen. Baudrillard is criticizing the very structure of what modernism would tell us is something that we should have accepted happened there. It's all wrapped around this notion of a clean war, that, you know, what happened during the war was that the military controlled the media message. Lots of pictures of weaponry, including the smart bombs, and relatively few casualties, and no casualties from the Allies. The technological simulacra neither displace nor deter the violent reality of war. They become an integral part of its operational procedures. And we see this with wars since, the way that war is presented to us is as a simulation. We are distant from war itself. We experience it only through media footage, which is edited, controlled, and there to tell a particular set of storylines, which we already understand through our knowledge of war as a genre of entertainment. So what does this have to do with the media? Well, we are no longer in a logic of the passage from the virtual to actual, but in a hyper-realist logic of the deterrence of the real by the virtual. The virtual works to keep us away from the real and to keep us in the illusion, to keep us in the simulation. The virtual has overtaken the actual. It functions to deter the real events and leaves only the simulacrum of war, something created by the media. The media keeps us locked into circulation of signs and circulation of meanings created by signs and as far away from the real as possible. And we are stuck in a loop of unreality, which is now our reality. So, this masquerade of information, branded faces, delivered over to the prostitution of the image, the image of an unintelligible distress. It is not war taking place over there, but the disfiguration of the world. We are not alienated spectators, we are active agents of the virtual. We're the operators of virtuality, joyfully collaborating into our disappearance into the virtual. We accept this. We do not challenge it. We do not work against it. We consume more media. We produce more signs. We become involved in the symbolic order. We become involved in the creation of, distribution of, and circulation of signs as part of our everyday understanding of the world. Because of that, we are ever distant from the world itself. The real is lost to us. We cannot even access it. Now, that's all I want to say about Baudrillard at that point. It's an example of how postmodernist thought contributes towards what we can understand about the media. I mean, Baudrillard does not go uncriticized. I come from a philosophical background, and most philosophers I know think Baudrillard is some kind of charlatan who's just making stuff up. I mean, this is a great section about Baudrillard here that, Norris's Uncritical Theory in 1992. Bad philosophy has often gone along with bad politics, as we should scarcely need reminding after the Heidegger affair and kindred revolutions. Postmodernism is bad philosophy on every count. Not least, its uncritical adherence to a theory of language and representation whose extreme anti-realist or skeptical bias in the end gives rise to an outlook of thorough ongoing nihilism. That the Gulf War provided such a telling instance of our so-called postmodern condition is reason enough to take stock of that condition on its own. What Norris is really arguing here is that not only is this bad philosophy, but it actually leads to such bad outcomes that, we have to question the sanity of those who were involved in it. The Gulf War didn't happen. Maybe ask those dead people in Iraq if it happened or not. This is the kind of point Norris is making. Now, I think that perspective is important. But I also think what is important is how Baudrillard is giving us ammunition for the media. Now, I think it is important that we should recognize that there are limits to postmodernism, and there is a contradiction within postmodernism itself, which is, okay, if there's no master narratives in the world, then this explanation of the world and this explanation of the media given to us cannot be the only explanation that is there, right? And it is open to criticism itself. So we have to judge postmodernist positions on their utility and recognize that there will be other positions open to us. And that shouldn't be problematic for us as media scholars to do. In fact, we should embrace that notion. We should be postmodernists in itself. And even myself, as somebody who's broadly sympathetic with the postmodern position, what I'm also take on board from that is that I need to be very, very skeptical of any position that comes out of postmodernism itself. And I think whilst Norris is being critical towards the whole movement, what I can take from his work is actually, when somebody says the Gulf War didn't happen, we have to be very careful about what that means. So the other critiques of Baudrillard in particular, but postmodernism in general, is that it's a conservative critique of technology and its impact upon human relations and meaning, combined with the most radical extreme analysis of phenomena. It's very anti-empirical, our research methods. I mean, postmodernism itself says that, scientific method only produces other simulations. That's problematic in itself. I mean, I am broadly supportive of this view that science produces one version of the world, one way of explaining the world, and there are other there are other things available to us. But that's not to dismiss science. I'm not going to take a literary theorist's explanation of coronavirus, for example, and think that that's going to be superior to an epidemiologist's. There are positions in where these things are very, very important. I mean, what we should do as media students is read this work very, very carefully. What is Baudrillard actually trying to tell us? He's saying that the media reported a certain set of events as a war. Real-time reporting accelerated us into that war and into its uncertainty, into a modelled simulation. By being pushed there through real-time media, through 24-hour media feeds and live broadcasts and so on, we feel like we're pushed into a war, where actually we're just being pushed into the simulation of that war, which is constructed. Lots of live reporting from Saudi Arabia, etc. What happened there was a production of signs of war, not the real event itself. I think that critique that this theory and a lot of postmodernist thought would produce on this is really important. We need to sort of take that stuff on board. And this notion of hyper-reality is also extremely important. The way that the media and technology allows us to see more than is humanly possible should point us towards the fact that human beings, we're not seeing everything. Ironically, we're seeing more than we possibly could ever see, but we're only seeing a particular view of that all, and we're just seeing continual images in that way. You might want to think, well, where does Baudrillard end up in all this? Where's the logical end point? If all that's important in society is the circulation of signs, where's that going to lead us? For Baudrillard, it was the end of labour, the end of production, the end of the signified dialectic, which facilitates the accumulation of knowledge and meaning. At the same time, the end of simultaneously of the exchange value, use value dialectic, which is the only thing that makes accumulation and social production possible. The end of the classical era of the sign, and the end, really, classically, of civilization. The things which had value in the past lose all value, and all that becomes important is being a superstar on social media. Maybe he had a point. As we strive as individuals to do less work and become social media influencers with thousands of followers, and in platforms paying us just to circulate signs constantly, because that's how you make it in modern society, people. Become a YouTuber, become huge on TikTok, become massive on Insta. They'll pay you to advertise stuff to people, to create signs. There is no more labour. We're not producing anything but images, which then get circulated by others. Isn't that what society is telling us to do today? Kind of grim. So, how can we conclude this? Because I know you're grasping for a conclusion here. Postmodernism does not mean nothing is real. Baudrillard doesn't even, deny the existence of the real. He just says it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to understand what the real is and access the real in the age of hyperreality. We need to think more about what is presented as real. What the media gives us is constructed, made, These processes are done for a reason, but truth is a concept that can be encoded into a media text in an objective sense, because all media is subjective. It is made and constructed. It is subjectively done. There is no such thing as objective media. Truth, therefore, is not something that we come from. And indeed, we don't view anything from a position of truth. We always view from a certain position, and sometimes we do that much more than we do at other times. We are subjective. The media is subjective. What we are presented with is subjective. And therefore, if media constructs our reality, then that reality is not objective in any way, shape or form. Our reality has been constructed for us, the simulation. So maybe Baudrillard was onto something really, really profound. And the postmodernist position, therefore, is very important in terms of how we understand the world as presented to us by media, which we know as media students is what happens. Okay, hit me up in comments if you got any questions. Otherwise, thanks very much, guys.